At 8:15 on a Monday morning, I stood at the counter of Grissom's Hardware, holding a small paper bag of finishing nails that cost $5.40, and the card reader flashed red. I'm Arthur Kessler, 71 years old, and before I tell you what happened after that little red light, tell me where you're watching from tonight in the comments. Hit like, hit subscribe, and if you've ever built something with your own two hands only to have someone younger decide, quietly and without asking you, that you'd become too old to be trusted with it, you already know exactly where this story is going. Ray Grissom himself was behind the counter that morning, a man I'd bought lumber and hardware from for almost 40 years. He tried the card twice, gave me the careful look of a man who didn't want to embarrass an old friend. Not going through, Arthur. You want to try another one? Try it again, I said. He did. Red light again. A young contractor behind me in line checked his watch, not rudely, just impatiently, the way young men do when they've got a schedule, and no memory yet of what it feels like to stand where I was standing. I told Ray I'd settle up another time, left the nails on the counter, and walked out to my truck. I sat there a moment before I called my son, Nathan. He picked up on the fourth ring, already sounding like a man bracing for a conversation he'd rehearsed. Hey, Dad, my card got declined at Grissom's. $5, Nathan. For nails. A pause, then careful words. Yeah, Dana and I went ahead and restructured the business accounts last week. We figured it was time you stepped back from the day-to-day stuff. Let us handle the money side. I sat very still behind the wheel. You restructured the business accounts. My business. Our business now, Dad. I mean functionally. You're 71. You should be enjoying retirement, not standing behind a table saw all day. In the background, I heard my daughter-in-law's voice, unbothered, unlowered. Just tell him it's for the best. He'll adjust. Nathan didn't repeat it. He didn't need to. I heard it clean enough through the phone. I understand, I said. Thank you, and I hung up. Because 43 years of running a business through recessions, lawsuits, and one very bad flood taught me exactly one thing above all others. The moment you feel the urge to shout is the exact moment to go quiet instead. I didn't drive home. I drove to my accountant's office. Let me tell you who I actually am, because it matters for everything that follows. In 1981, I started Kessler Woodworks out of a one-car garage with $1,100, a used table saw, and a handshake deal to build cabinets for a contractor who trusted me more than he probably should have. Over the next 4 decades, that garage became a 22,000-square-foot custom woodworking shop employing 31 people, building everything from kitchen cabinetry to custom church pews to boardroom tables for 3 different Fortune 500 regional offices. I never went to business school. I learned the hard way, the way most tradesmen my age did, by nearly losing everything twice and figuring out, painfully, how not to lose it a third time. Nathan grew up in that shop. Sawdust in his hair before he could read. I always assumed, the way fathers assume things they never quite say out loud, that one day he'd take it over, and that I'd hand it to him the way my own mentor never got the chance to hand anything to me. 8 years ago, when Nathan turned 30, I made him general manager and transferred him a minority ownership stake, 20%, as a step toward eventually stepping back myself. I kept the remaining 80%, split between myself and a small family trust I'd set up years earlier with my late wife Joan before she passed. Nathan knew about the 20%. What he apparently forgot or never fully understood was exactly how the ownership split had actually been documented. I never talked much about the specifics of the ownership structure at the dinner table. Joan used to say the workshop stayed at the workshop and the father came home, and I liked that division. I wanted Nathan to grow into leadership on his own merit, not spend his life feeling like he was standing in the shadow of a controlling founder who never let go. I want to tell you about the moment I should have paid closer attention to, because I've replayed it many times since. About 6 months ago at a company holiday party, one of our longtime foremen, a good man named Curtis, who'd been with me 22 years, mentioned to Nathan that it must feel good knowing he'd take over the company outright someday. Nathan smiled and said, "Won't be long now." Dad's slowing down. I was standing 8 feet away holding a paper plate of ham. He never looked at me when he said it. I didn't think much of it that night. I should have. 3 weeks ago, I drove to the shop for what I believed was an ordinary Monday morning walkthrough, the same walkthrough I'd done every week for 4 decades. When I pulled into my usual spot near the loading dock, my keycard didn't work on the side door. I used the front entrance instead and found the front office locks had been changed too. A small brass keypad now sat where my old deadbolt used to be. Nathan was in the main office, seated behind what used to be my desk, a manila folder squared in front of him. Dana stood by the window with her arms crossed. "Dad," Nathan said, standing, "glad you're here. We need to talk through some things." I sat across from him. He slid the folder across the desk. Inside was a buyout proposal, my name at the top, offering to purchase my remaining ownership stake at what I recognized immediately. Having built and sold 2 smaller businesses in my life, before Joan and I ever started this one, as roughly 60% of fair market value. Beneath it sat a letter, already drafted on company letterhead, announcing my transition to founder emeritus to all 31 employees. I read every line twice before I said a word, because 43 years of negotiating with suppliers, banks, and difficult clients taught me the same lesson the courtroom teaches judges. The man who speaks first in a room like this usually loses control of it. "What's prompted this?" I said finally. "Exactly?" Nathan shifted. "Dad, you had that dizzy spell in the shop back in October. Curtis had to help you sit down. That scared everybody. I stood up too fast after being bent under a workbench for 20 minutes. My doctor checked my blood pressure the next day. It was normal. Still, it got Dana and me thinking. We don't want you falling off a ladder at 71 and getting hurt because you refuse to slow down. So this is concern for my safety. Partly. What's the other part?" Nathan hesitated. Dana from the window said, "The other part, Arthur, is that this company needs modern leadership to keep growing. No offense, but you still do half your quoting on paper." I closed the folder gently and set my hands flat on the desk that used to be mine. "Has this offer been reviewed by an independent business valuator, or did you two draft this number yourselves?" Silence answered that question better than words could have. "I appreciate," I said, standing, gathering my coat, "that you believe you're doing what's best. I'm going to need time to think about this." "Dad, don't make this weird," Nathan said. "It's just business." "It stopped being just business," I said, "the moment you changed the locks before you talked to me." I drove home that morning without the radio on, and for the first time in a very long while, I felt the old cold clarity I used to feel the night before a difficult contract negotiation, not anger, which I'd watched ruin more than one good tradesman's career over 4 decades in this business, but something quieter and far more dangerous to whoever stood on the other side of it. The specific stillness of a man who has just realized he's being profoundly underestimated by people who have no real idea what he actually built. I want you to understand something about the ownership documents, because it matters enormously for everything that follows. 8 years earlier, when I transferred Nathan his 20% stake, my attorney at the time, a sharp, meticulous man named Franklin Whitcomb, had insisted we document it a very specific way, structured through the family trust rather than a simple direct gift, with a clause requiring unanimous trustee approval for any sale, merger, or restructuring of company ownership above a certain threshold. I remember Franklin telling me, half joking, half serious, "Arthur, love your son, but don't ever let sentiment override structure. Structure is what protects both of you when sentiment runs out." I'd thought it slightly cynical at the time. Standing in that reshuffled office 3 weeks ago, I understood exactly what he'd meant. I called Franklin that same afternoon. He was semi-retired now, working 2 days a week out of a small office downtown, but he answered his own phone the way he always had. "Arthur, it's been a while. Tell me this isn't as bad as your voice sounds." I told him everything. The changed locks, the buyout offer, the letter already drafted announcing my removal, the fact that no independent valuation had been done. He was quiet for a long moment. "I want to be direct with you," he said. "Structurally, nothing they're proposing is enforceable without your signature and the trust's unanimous approval, which means legally right now they can't force this. But Arthur, I need you to understand something important. The fact that they attempted it this way, changing physical access before having the conversation, drafting an internal announcement before you'd agreed to anything, that's a meaningful pattern. I want a full review of every financial decision made at that company over the last 6 months before we do anything else. Agreed. And Arthur, do not sign anything. Not an acknowledgement, not a revised org chart, nothing, until I've seen it. Over the following 2 weeks, Franklin and I worked with an independent forensic accountant named Priya Deshmukh to review the company's books. What we found troubled me more than the locks ever did. 6 months earlier, without informing me, Nathan had begun negotiations to acquire a smaller competing woodshop across the county, financing the acquisition through a substantial line of credit secured against Kessler Woodworks' commercial property, the same property I still held majority ownership of through the trust. The loan documents listed Nathan as sole authorized signatory, a designation the bank should never have approved without my sign-off as majority owner, but apparently had based on paperwork suggesting Nathan held full authority, paperwork I had never actually reviewed or signed. This is where it gets serious, Priya told me during our third meeting, sliding a printed loan summary across the table. The bank's file includes a signed authorization form granting Nathan sole signing authority over company assets for financing purposes. Your signature is on it. I looked at the signature. It resembled mine closely, the way a forgery resembles the real thing when someone has studied it carefully, rather than copied it clumsily. I never signed this, I said. Franklin leaned forward. Are you certain, Arthur? Take your time. I'm certain. I remember every document I've signed involving this company in the last year. I did not sign this. Franklin exchanged a look with Priya. Then we need to have this signature formally examined, he said, and we need to contact the bank directly, on the record, before anything further happens with that credit line. I want to tell you what I felt sitting in that meeting, because it would have been easy, natural even, to feel simple fury toward my son. What I actually felt, staring at that imitation of my own signature, was something closer to grief. Somewhere in the last year, the boy who'd once fallen asleep on a stack of lumber, waiting for me to finish a late job, had decided the easiest way past an inconvenient. Aging father was not to have a hard conversation, but to quietly maneuver around him. The bank's compliance department confirmed within 12 days that the signature, authorization did not match, verified signature samples on file for me from prior loan documents I actually had signed years earlier. The credit line, $640,000, had already been partially drawn against to fund the competitor acquisition. Franklin called me the evening the bank's findings came through. Arthur, I need to ask you something important. What outcome do you actually want here? Because we now have enough, the buyout attempt, the changed locks, a forged signature on a bank authorization, to pursue this very aggressively if you choose. Formal complaint to the bank, a demand letter to Nathan directly, potentially even a referral for fraud investigation given the dollar amount involved. I thought about Nathan as a boy, small hands wrapped around a hand plane too big for him, learning to feel the grain of wood before he learned much else. I thought about my grandchildren, Nathan's 2 kids, who I loved without reservation, regardless of what their father had done. I don't want to destroy my son, I said finally. But I built this company from $1,100 and a used table saw, and I am not going to sit quietly while he forges my signature to fund a deal I never approved, then changes my locks and calls it retirement. I want the truth on the table, all of it. And then I want to see what he does with it. That, Franklin said, we can absolutely build. We spent the next 10 days preparing carefully. Franklin drafted a formal notice to the bank, revoking the fraudulent authorization and demanding immediate correction of the loan file, supported by the signature examiner's findings, which confirmed within a week that the authorization signature had very likely been produced by someone practicing my signature from other documents, rather than by me directly. I asked Franklin for one more thing, not a lawsuit, not yet, but a formal meeting, at the shop, with Nathan, Dana, myself, Franklin present as counsel, and, at my specific request, Curtis, our longtime foreman, whose decades of loyalty to this company deserved to see this handled with full transparency rather than behind closed doors. I called Nathan myself to arrange it. I'd like everyone in the main office Thursday afternoon. There are some things that need to be discussed properly. Dad, is this about the buyout offer? Have you decided? Everything is about to be very clear, I said. That's all I'll say for now. Thursday afternoon, Franklin sat quietly at the end of the same conference table where, decades earlier, I'd signed the paperwork incorporating Kessler Woodworks in the first place. Curtis stood near the door, uncertain why he'd been asked to attend but too respectful to ask. Nathan and Dana sat across from me, Nathan's confidence from 3 weeks earlier visibly thinner now. Franklin, Nathan said carefully, this is my father's attorney. Your father's attorney of many years, Franklin confirmed pleasantly. Shall we begin? I opened my own folder, placing it in the center of the table exactly where Nathan's buyout offer had sat 3 weeks earlier. First, I said, I want you both to see this. I slid the bank's findings across. Dana picked it up first, read it, and her expression shifted. A forged authorization, she read aloud. Nathan, what is this? Nathan's face had already gone pale. Dad, I can explain. I had signing authority already for smaller purchases. I just extended it for the acquisition, because I knew you'd have wanted to move fast on that deal if you'd had time to think it through properly. And there wasn't time to wait for... You didn't think you needed to ask, I said quietly, finishing his sentence the way I'd finished sentences for difficult suppliers 100 times over the years. That's the entire problem, Nathan. Not that you didn't care about the business. I believe you cared. The problem is somewhere along the way. You stopped believing you needed my permission to make $640,000 decisions about a company I still majority own. The room went very still. Curtis by the door shifted his weight but said nothing. I want to explain something, I continued, that I probably should have made clearer years ago. When I gave you your 20% stake, I structured it deliberately through the family trust, with a clause requiring unanimous trustee approval for any major restructuring or sale above a certain threshold. That wasn't me not trusting you, Nathan. That was me protecting both of us, so that no single person, including me, could unilaterally gamble with this company's future. I didn't know that clause existed, Nathan said quietly. I thought once I had 20% I had real authority. You had real authority over day-to-day operations, I said. You never had unilateral authority over the company's capital structure. That authority required my signature, or a majority trustee vote, which is why I slid the second document across. The signature on this bank authorization concerns me so deeply. Nathan stared at the signature comparison Priya had prepared. His hands were visibly shaking now. I didn't forge that, he said, though his voice had lost most of its conviction. I filled out the form. I might have. I was in a hurry, the loan officer needed it same day. I might have signed on your behalf, assuming you'd have approved it, if you'd had time. You signed my name, I said, without asking me, on a document worth over $500,000, secured against property I majority own. There is no version of that sentence that ends in, assuming you'd have approved it. That is precisely the conversation you were supposed to have with me before you did it. Dana had gone very quiet. Franklin spoke for the first time. Nathan, I want to ask you something directly, and I'd encourage you to answer honestly because the bank's fraud department is already reviewing this independently of anything happening in this room today. Did you or did you not sign your father's name on that authorization form without his knowledge? Nathan's shoulders dropped. I did, he said quietly. I told myself it wasn't really lying because I was going to tell him eventually, once the acquisition closed and it was already working out. That is precisely how forgery becomes forgery, Franklin said, not unkindly. It is always in the moment, framed as a shortcut rather than a lie. I let that settle in the room, because there is nothing more useful in a moment like this than allowing a person to hear their own justification spoken back to them without anyone rushing to soften it. I built this company, I said finally, starting in a one-car garage with $1,100 back when you weren't even born yet, Nathan. I've weathered 2 recessions, a flood that put us underwater for 6 weeks, and a lawsuit that nearly ended everything in 1996. I did not survive all of that by being reckless with what I built, and I am not going to stand by while it's gambled with behind my back, regardless of who's doing the gambling. Nathan put both hands over his face. When he lowered them, his eyes were wet. And I want to be fair to him here because what came next was not performance. I convinced myself I was moving the company forward the way you'd have wanted, if you weren't slowing down, he said. I kept telling myself, once this acquisition proves out, once I've grown the company past what you built alone, you'd be proud. And none of the process would matter anymore. He looked at Dana. I let myself believe the ends justified whatever shortcuts got us there. They never do, I said quietly. Not in business and not in family. Curtis, standing by the door, spoke for the first time, his voice careful. Arthur, if I can say something. I've worked here 22 years. I've watched this company grow because you never once cut a corner with a client, a supplier, or an employee, even when cutting a corner would have been easier and more profitable. That's why people stayed. That's the whole reason this place is worth acquiring competitors in the first place. He looked at Nathan. I think you forgot that's what actually built the value you were trying to protect. Nathan didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. I'm not here today, I said finally, to remove you from this company, Nathan. Franklin can tell you, I have every legal ground to do exactly that right now, given what the bank has confirmed, but that isn't what I want. I closed the folder. What I want is for you to understand that ownership isn't the same thing as authority, and love for this company doesn't give anyone the right to gamble with it behind another owner's back, especially not by forging his signature. Dana finally spoke quietly. I told him the buyout offer was fair. I told him you'd probably be relieved to finally slow down. She looked at me. I think I wanted that to be true more than I actually knew it was true. I know, I said. That's often exactly how these things happen. Not one enormous betrayal all at once. A series of smaller decisions, each one easier to justify than the last, until you're standing in a room explaining a forged signature to your father's attorney. We talked for nearly 2 more hours that afternoon. I informed the bank formally in writing that the fraudulent authorization was revoked and that any further credit decisions required my direct, verified signature going forward. I did not pursue formal fraud charges against my son, though Franklin made clear the option remained fully available if this pattern repeated. I did, however, restructure the trust's governance immediately, adding an independent corporate trustee, a firm Franklin had worked with for decades, with authority equal to my own over any major capital decision, specifically so that no single person, myself included, could ever again unilaterally gamble with what this company had taken 43 years to build. Before Nathan and Dana left that evening, Nathan stood in the doorway for a long moment. I don't know how to fix this, he said quietly. Do you start, I said, by asking instead of assuming. Every time. For a very long time, until trust rebuilds itself, which it will, but slowly and only through consistency, not one conversation. He nodded and left without another word. The months that followed weren't dramatic. There was no single grand reconciliation scene, no dramatic embrace in a boardroom. Real change, in my experience across 4 decades of business and family both, rarely announces itself. It shows up quietly in ordinary Tuesdays. Nathan began calling me before making decisions, not asking permission for every small thing, but genuinely checking in on anything significant, the way a real partner does rather than a man managing an inconvenient elder. He personally called the bank to correct the authorization records, insisting on doing it himself rather than letting Franklin's office handle it entirely, which I respected more than I told him at the time. 6 weeks after that Thursday meeting, Nathan stopped by my house on a Saturday morning, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner we used to visit when he was in high school. I wanted to ask you something, he said, sitting across from me at my kitchen table, and I want an honest answer. Do you actually want to keep working? Or did I use your age as an excuse because it was easier than admitting I wasn't ready to run this alone yet? I thought about that for a long moment before answering. Both things can be true, Nathan. I do want to keep working, at least part-time, for a few more years, and you probably weren't fully ready to run it entirely alone yet, not because you're not capable, but because nobody's ready to run something alone the first time they try. I wasn't either back in 1981. I just didn't have anyone senior enough to forge a signature against. He laughed, despite himself, a tired, genuine laugh. That's fair. What I needed, I continued, wasn't for you to wait for me to disappear. I needed you to ask me directly what role I actually wanted going forward, instead of deciding for me and hoping I'd go along with it quietly. I know that now, he said. I should have known it before. We worked out over the following months an actual transition plan, built together rather than imposed by either of us. I stepped back from daily operations, but remained majority owner and chairman for at least another 3 years, with Nathan taking full operational leadership under the oversight of the independent trustee, a structure that protected the company, protected Nathan from himself in moments of overconfidence, and protected me from ever again being locked out of my own workshop by someone convinced he was acting in my best interest. About a year after that Monday morning at Grissom's Hardware, I walked back into the same store, picked up the same small bag of finishing nails, and handed my card to Ray behind the counter. "540, Ray said. The card went through without a sound. No hesitation, no red light. No line of younger men checking their watches, while an old carpenter fumbled with declined plastic. Just an ordinary transaction on an ordinary morning. As I walked out to my truck, my phone buzzed. A text from Nathan. "Heading to the shop early to walk the new apprentice through the joinery room. Want to come by and show him how you used to do the dovetails by hand?" He keeps asking about it. I smiled, got into my truck, and drove toward the shop I'd built from $1,100 and a used table saw. Feeling, for the first time in a long while, entirely certain of exactly where I belonged. The lesson I carry out of all this is not complicated, though it took 43 years of building something with my own hands and one very difficult season inside my own family to fully understand it. Building something for someone doesn't give them the right to decide quietly and without asking that you've become an obstacle to it. Real respect means asking the harder question directly, even when assuming feels faster and kinder in the moment. And sometimes the people who most need reminding of what you're still capable of are the ones who love you most, and simply forgot to ask before they started managing you out of your own life's work. If this story reminded you of someone in your own family, a father, a mentor, or perhaps even yourself, I hope you'll remember to ask before you assume. And if it moved you, I'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribed for more stories about family, dignity, and the quiet strength it takes to demand to be asked instead of managed.